Why is it important in the Dark Ages, in those dark times, in the times of the Saxons and the Vikings, that you had some sort of a method of carrying things? Because if you was marching, if you was walking to a town for instance, you may not want to have all your weapons and your wooden bowl in your hand, so having a shoulder bag is quite an authentic thing to have. But unfortunately, because of the archaeology, because we don't often find these things unless the soil is in an amabro, is in a certain, because the soil conditions are dry, materials like this rot. When they are heavily laden with water, we tend to find these sort of bags of materials or fragments of. So I think it's very important that you do have a shoulder bag. Now this one here I bought from eBay with another one, and I bought one for me and one for Eggle, and it's a linen bag and also has a nice brown linen coating on the inside, and I think it's a very nice material. It has a runic inscription and also a little bit of embroidery. The decoration is something we don't often think about with such items, but let's face it, you made yourself in the summer a nice leather shoulder bag or one of wool or linen, and you're a little bit bored in the winter time. Well, you're going to take your time to sew on some runes or maybe some patterns like they have done here, and I think this is very authentic. So when you're on the march, you may have a wooden bowl, you may have a spoon, because you got to eat your dinner and the food you make out of something. You can't put a stew or a soup in your hands, so you would carry your bowl. You may have a few coins in there, a flint and steel, and the things that you would need to survive on the march, because it's so important that you have the ability to make fire. This is why everybody carried an axe, because axes are so important for chopping down trees, for making shelter, for making kindling, for light, for helping your fire to grow with the wood you have managed to coppice and chop down. And you know, when you go to the period of 1086, we often think of England as being a very heavy wooded place. But they do say, with the research that has been done in various papers, that only 10 to 15% of England by 1086 was wooded. Don't forget, within the times of the Celts, and especially the Romans, when they came and conquered Britannia, they deforested on a vast scale because everybody needed farmland. And it's quite interesting that in some of the evidence from longhouses from the Saxon period, some of the trees that were quite gigantic and very old at the time dated from the 5th century. So by the time you got to the 7th or 8th century, the trees that were growing wild in the 5th century after the collapse of the Roman Empire in Britannia, we can see the evidence that the trees grew from that period onwards. And there's also some speculation and some evidence which points out that the Romano-British and the people that were left over when the Romans left, because let's face it, there was many a place where the Romans continued living in luxury after the Romans and the Roman army left. This kind of shows that in evidence that they may have replanted trees because they knew that trees were such an important aspect of culture. And we often think about the Saxons having iron weapons and sea axes, but in theory, and it's very true, that in fact it was a wood age, because your buildings, your cooking utensils like bowls, your longships, your handles for your spears and so forth were all made from wood. So yes, the Saxon period was very much an age of wood, but don't forget, a lot of those trees would have been sacrificed because they're being chopped down and managed because they needed the farmland. So I find that to be quite fascinating within itself. And when we think about coppicing, how we have coppice cycles. So what is coppicing? Coppicing is when you take a hazel tree and you chop it right down in the winter time to the base, and then it suddenly, because it's got a mass amount of roots, in the springtime it pushes up new shoots, and then they would be managed between a 5 and a 25 year period depending on what you needed the wood for. a lot of it would be for posts, for making your walls and your longhouses. But the Saxons were very clever because they also pollarded. So for instance, we all have heard of willow trees. They would pollard willow trees, you know, way up top. And then the willow tree, because it's lost all of its branches, would again shoot up a lot of new shoots, and they would be trained over 5 and 25 years to become sturdy poles. And a lot of the fence poles, a lot of the poles from longhouses were made from willow. So it shows you, and we have lost that ability to a certain degree to coppice, even though there are people that do practice coppicing in the UK, and I think it's a fascinating thing. And when you go through an old wood, which is hundreds of years old, you can see the trees that have been coppiced and the ones that have not. And this would have been practiced up to World War II. So coppicing is a very old thing. It goes back, way back to the Stone Age, when we had the ability to make stone axes. We had the ability to chop down trees, and the people from that time also understood about coppicing. So it's such an important aspect, and I hope you find this video to be interesting. But you know, wood wasn't just used for longhouses and for ships, it was also used for making clubs. It was used for making hammers and mallets. So although a hammer is traditionally a metal object, a mallet is the wooden equivalent. But this here is a wooden club that I've been making for a while, and I must say it's getting to the point where it's getting quite nice. So we take for granted these days the ability our ancestors had to read the land, to know where the good wood and the wood was sourced from, and it also demonstrates that from one generation to another generation they was managing and coppicing and looking after woodlands and forests because they needed that wood. You know, a long house or a round house in the Iron Age would only last for so many years. At some point the wood rots and it will collapse in and you have to start again. Or even worse, your long house or your round house may catch fire, and well, that's a very dangerous thing to happen and it will soon spread. So I think it demonstrates that over one generation to another generation, from father to son, what they would pass down the rights to their woods, and those woods would be managed and coppiced. Wood was valuable, and where would the Saxons be without wood? Without wood there would be no Viking Age, because there would be no longships, but they also needed iron, which is a whole entire subject for another day.